Hey, this is Pastor Trina up very early, extremely early. Actually, I've been up all night. I've been sick and slept a lot, so I'm up. Um, some of you know that I have a live show on Tuesdays and Thursdays called the Two-Edged Sword Show. And I was actually going to save this for that show, but, well, I still may do this show, but I want to get some things straight. I am so sick of this hype about slavery, especially from people today who have never been a slave nor have owned a slave. Slavery ended years ago. No one is a slave today unless you're a Democrat. Then you are a slave to liberalism. Hate me? Send hate mail? Matter of fact, if you want to send me a hate mail, go right ahead. I would love to put it on my live show. The email is the two-edged sword show, the two-edged sword show at gmail.com. Send it, because I will debunk everything that you say when it comes to black slavery being so bad. As we know, Jews were slaughtered and enslaved, and I'm not going to get into that, but I will on my show. But what I do want to do is I want to point to some facts. And I'll give you the source of these facts. Now, pay very close attention, okay? Because this is quite a bit. Slavery truths. Fact 1. The first official slave owner in America was an Angolan who adopted the European name of Anthony Johnson. He was sold to slave traders in 1621 by an enemy tribe in his native Africa and was registered as Antonio, quote, a Negro, in the official records of the colony of Virginia. He went to work for a white farmer as an indentured servant. Prior to 1654, all Africans in the 13 colonies were held in indentured servitude and were released after a contracted period, with many of the indentured receiving land and equipment after their contracts for work expired. Johnson would later take ownership of a large plot of farmland after the expiration of his contract, and using the skills he had learned during his indentured labor service, Johnson became moderately successful. By July 1651, Johnson and 5 indentured servants of his own. In 1664, he brought a case before Virginia courts in which he contested a suit launched by one of his indentured servants, a Negro who adopted the name John Casser. John won the suit and retained Casser as his servant for life, who thus became the first official and true slave in America. Thus, the accusation that whites started slavery in America is utterly untrue. Blacks in America sold each other as slaves, and the first true lifelong slave in America was owned by a black man, not a white man. Fact 2. The transatlantic slave trade was dwarfed by the Arab or Muslim slave trade, which lasted from 650 AD to 1900 AD. It is estimated that a minimum of 18 million Africans were enslaved by Arab slave traders, and that over 1 million Europeans were enslaved by the Muslim world during the same period. I find that ironic that you want to vote for someone who wants to bring the people that enslaved around 18 million Africans at the time, Arabs and Muslims enslaved you, your ancestors, that is. And I find it odd that you want to vote for someone who wants to bring them into our country. The Muslim slave trade saw Africans exported to regions throughout the Middle East and even to India, while the Europeans were captured in raids: Spain, Italy, France, Britain, and Ireland. These raids were launched from North Africa, and during the Islamic occupation of Iberia and southern Italy from the latter regions as well. The invasion of southeastern Europe by the Ottoman Turks saw even more Europeans enslaved into the Muslim world, but their numbers are unknown. The Muslim trade in slaves, both black and white, was therefore longer lasting and far more extensive than the transatlantic slave trade, but there are today no cries of Arab guilt or demands for reparations against Muslim nations. Fact 3. James Oglethorpe, from 1696 to 1785, was a British general who founded the colony of Georgia in 1732. From the very beginning, Oglethorpe ensured that slavery was banned in the colony and the Africans were barred from entering the territory. The colony's founding charter also forbade Roman Catholicism from being established in the region. It was only in 1750, after Oglethorpe had left the colony, that the ban of slavery was lifted. Fact 4. Many free Negroes owned black slaves. In fact, in numbers disproportionate to their representation in society at large. In 1830, a fourth of the free Negro slave masters in South Carolina owned 10 or more slaves, 8 owning 30 or more. According to federal census reports, on June 1st, 1860, there were nearly 4.5 Negroes in the United States, with fewer than 4 million of them living in the southern states, or the southern slaveholding states. Of the blacks residing in South, 261,988 were not slaves. Let me repeat that. 2,061,988 were not slaves. On this number, 10,689 lived in New Orleans. Black Duke University professor John Hope Franklin recorded that in New Orleans over 3,000 free Negroes owned slaves, or 28% of the free Negroes in the city. In 1860, I have not had no sleep. In 1860, there were at least 6 Negroes in Louisiana who owned 65 or more slaves. The largest number counted was 152 slaves that were owned by the widow C. Charles and her son P.C. Richards, who owned a large sugarcane plantation. Another Negro slave magnate in Louisiana with over 100 slaves was Antoine Dubuclet, a sugar planter whose estate was valued at, in 1861 or 1860, at $264,000. In Charleston, South Carolina, in 1860, 125 free Negroes owned 6 slaves, 6 of them owning 10 or more. Of the 1.5 million in taxable property owned by free Negroes in Charleston, more than 300,000 represented slaveholdings. In North Carolina, 69 free Negroes were slave owners. This source comes from Black masters, a free family of color in the Old South, Michael P. Johnson and James L. Roque of New York at Norton, 1984. Fact 5. In 1860, only a small minority of whites owned slaves. According to the U.S. Census report for that last year before the Civil War, there were nearly 27 million whites in the country. Some 8 million of them lived in the slaveholding states. The census also determined that there were fewer than 385,000 individuals who owned slaves. Even if all the slaveholders had been white, that would amount to only 1.4% of whites in the country, or 4.8% of Southern whites owning one or more slaves. The figures show conclusively that when free, blacks disproportionately became slave masters in pre-Civil War America. The statistics outlined above show that 28% of free blacks owned slaves, as opposed to less than 4.8% of Southern whites, and dramatically more than the 1.4% of all white Americans who owned slaves. It's a simple fact of the anti-white establishment that the transatlantic slave trade is known to all, but knowledge of the Muslim trade in European is deliberately suppressed. Europeans are continually blamed for African slavery, even though only a tiny minority were ever involved in it, and it was Europeans who brought it to an end. But no one ever dares blame the Muslim world for their slave trade in Africans and Europeans, which lasted for centuries longer than the Atlantic slave trade. It was during the 1600s that Barbary corsairs, pirates from the Barbary coast of North Africa, which is today Algeria, Libya, and Morocco, were at their most active and terrible. With the full support of the Moorish rulers of North America, these Muslim slavers raided southern Europe and the Atlantic European coast, Britain and Ireland, almost at will. Now, yes, I know that white people bought slaves, but keep in mind, slaves were also sold by Africans. In New Orleans, 40% of blacks owned black slaves, and that was taught at Duke by an African American professor. The idea that all white people were for slavery is a lie. Less than 2% of them ever owned slaves or had anything to do with slavery. And now there should be something to commend white people who died to free slaves. So get it through your head. Slavery is not what you really think it is. Again, I gave you the sources as I read this for you to go back and read, and it was from a black historian. Now, I want to point something out to you. I'm of Irish and Native Indian descent. Irish were taken as slaves. Indians were slaughtered. They were forced to inbreed with Irish. That's why you see a lot of Native American mixed with Irish. Now, 145 million estimated, 145 estimated of million Native Americans were killed. Let me repeat that. An estimate of 145 million of my ancestors were killed. The Irish population during slavery with the Irish dropped from 9 million to 3 million. Do the math. If there were 9 million and it dropped to 3 million, that means 6 million of my ancestors were slaves, tortured, just like my Native American ancestors were slaved and tortured, raped, you name it. Now here's a number that's really going to make the liberals mad. Less than 5 million Africans were tortured or died. Matter of fact, the going number is 12.5 million. Coffee now. Now, I have been trying to figure out this narrative that you have, that you've brought up today about slavery. My people were here first. My Native American people were here first. And my ancestors, were slaughtered and killed, raped, tortured, and forced to have sex with Irish or whoever. Irish were tortured just the same, and their torture and the slaughter of my ancestors, the numbers were much greater. I have no ill will against anyone of any color, any race, creed, or culture for what happened at a time that I was not alive to see. Does it bother me? It hurts, yes. But I wasn't there. And you weren't there. Tell me, do you work in a white man's house? Mop their floors? Bring their dinner? Milk their cows? Run their ranch? No, you don't. And if you do, you get paid for it. Back in the days of slavery, those that were slaves, the vast majority, were grateful for their freedom because they were being traded. They were happier to be in America than in Arab countries. They were happy that they had a roof over their head, a job, and the freedom to go out with their other friends and sit in the fields and sing gospel hymns. Do any of you even know who wrote the song Amazing Grace and the story behind him? You need to find out who wrote that song that you sing in church almost every Sunday. Now, I could be wrong, and I'm just throwing this theory out there, but I feel like that this whole slavery thing is something to cover up the black on black crime, the statistics of crime. And I urge you all to check out the Department of Justice, the FBI, the CDC, and the DoD crime statistics. A white person is more out to be a victim of a black person, and a black person is more out to be the victim of a black person. Take a look at Chicago. You know, Black Lives, you talk about Black Lives Matter, but how come they don't matter in Chicago? How come they don't matter when you're killing each other? I don't understand that. I mean, it makes no sense. Sorry, my foot fell asleep. It makes no sense. When I say all lives matter, people get so offended. They call it racist. How is it that saying all lives matter, every creed, color, ethnicity, race, everything, all lives matter? Believe it or not, criminals' lives matter because Christ died for everyone. He did not say, I'm going to the cross for Africans. I'm not going to the cross for Europeans. I'm not going to the cross for natives or Jews or Gentiles. He died for everybody. So you know what? Christ put that to rest a long time ago. So why do you keep it up? I'm going to tell you something else that's going to upset you. I'll tell you why you keep it up. Because the liberals, well, they want your vote. That's all it is. They want your vote. If they could get you to feel like that you are a victim, then it's easy to grab you. You're not a victim. You're only a victim if you choose to be. There are people that are raped. There are people that have lost family, loved ones in the military to give you freedom. The freedom that you have to burn our flag. When you burn our flag, you don't have the right to be here. But there's, like I said, women that's been raped that have chosen, I'm not going to be a victim. Yes, this happened, but I'm not going to be a victim. Now, slavery did not happen to you. Slavery is gone, except for liberalism. The thing that gets me is, if slavery bothers you so bad, why are you rushing out to vote for a white woman who protested against the civil rights marches? A Democrat. A Democrat created slavery. A Democrat created the Klan, the KKK. So you could look at it any way you want, but because, one, you were not a slave, you did not live through it, I would be surprised to know if anyone today was ever a slave. But if slavery is such an issue, but you're running out to vote for the person whose party created it, then you have another agenda. Slavery has nothing to do with it. You know what Hitler did? Hitler did the same thing that the Democrats do. Divide and conquer. They are dividing us, and you're falling for it. And then, after they divide us, they're going to conquer you because you fell into their trap. And you're easier to conquer because you believe their lies. You know, if you really went out there into Chicago and talked to many what I call African Americans or Americans whose skin just happens to be black, then you would find out that they'll tell you the Democrats have done nothing for them. So go ahead. Let liberals make you think you're a victim. What they're really telling you is that you're weak and that you need the government to be your daddy or your mother or your caretaker because you're incapable of doing it yourself. That makes you a slave. Think about it. Do some research. Stop watching the garbage news. The mainstream media is a lie. Politicians lie too. And you're lying to yourself. Let me repeat. 145 million of my ancestors were killed, of the Native Americans, and the Irish were 6 million. Less than 5 million, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were slaves, and a majority were owned by blacks. Get your facts. Because you know what? Your victim card don't work with me. And your race card don't work with me. None of it works with me. It doesn't work with people that actually know the facts. It's time that you know the facts. All you gotta do is get off of Facebook. Get off Twitter. Get off the couch. Turn your computer and do some research. You don't want me to get into the crime statistics, but I will on my next show. Maybe. So until then, I really hope this video gets to somebody and opens up your minds, because if not, you're going to be a victim of your own game. And you always will be. Oppression starts in the mind. You're not oppressed. You have just as many opportunities, if not more, than I do. You have the Negro College Fund. We don't have the Caucasian College Fund. Think about it. So until then, I think I'm going to sign out. I'm tired and I'm frustrated because I'm sick and tired of hearing this race card stuff. It's garbage. It's baloney. Problem is, all of you people yelling racism are the racist. And the second problem is, you better take a look at your heart, kiddos. You better find some God. You better find some Christ. You better get your prayer up, because there's something wrong with your heart. So, until next time, I'll catch you later.